Starting from 1811, this book takes us through centuries of reports that have made Philippine journalism what it is today. We'll learn about the early days of news from the author of Balita, The Story of Philippine Journalism, 1811 to 2019, Jose Victor Torres. Vic, great to have you with us. My first question to you is, was there already fake news in the 1800s?
Yes, there was. Surprisingly, there was fake news, and you'd be surprised to learn that this was news spread by people like Jose Rizal.
Oh.
Because part of their propaganda for the reform movement was, of course, to construct stories about the church. Now, remember, the reformist movement was very anti-clerical, so they really had to, take stories that were being told in the Philippines. When it reaches Spain, the story becomes different. It becomes quite exaggerated. So it ends up, without using the definition of terms, it ends up as fake news.
Disinformation.
Because these are news that are made for people to believe.
Yes, disinformation, no? Sensationalized news as well. How significant was journalism, Vic, as a vital part of communication in the 18 and 1900s?
It was the only form of communication at that time, especially internationally and locally within the provinces, because the most important aspect of communication in the 19th century was the printing press. And remember, the radio and the television came much later. So newspapers were very important during the time, especially for businesses.
And how many publications were there during that period?
Actually, there were almost hundreds. So because that was my difficulty in researching about this book on Philippine journalism, because some newspapers would last like for 5 issues only, some would last for several years, some would practically just last for 1 issue. Then it would entirely disappear, yet each and every aspect of this newspaper was very important. But of course, defining society at that time, and of course, spreading what can be gathered in different parts of the Philippines at different points in time.
But Vic, the question now is, were the journalists during the 1800s and 1900s trained journalists? Did they study journalism? Or are they the type of journalists that we have today? We have citizen journalists, we have untrained journalists, we have vloggers, bloggers. Everyone wants to be a journalist now.
Actually, it was like that before. Everyone who wants to have to write something about the country, who wants to write something about the event can write. But I think one of the things that would eventually happen in the course of time was when the first schools of journalism were put up during the American period. Right? So journalism was eventually systematized. But during this the Spanish period, everyone could write something about have it published in a newspaper, except for a certain period when feature articles about culture in the Philippines was carefully monitored and carefully edited by Jose Del Pan. He became what we call the Dean of Philippine Journalists in the 19th century, because he was the one who would invite writers and tell them what to write and provide them with the style on how to write these things.
Oh, wow. So there's still a lot of similarities of the journalism today in the 1800s. And as you mentioned, the School of Journalisms were established during the American period from the late, 1899 all the way up until the 1940s. But why do you stop your writing the book, Vic, in 2019?
There was too much information already. And remember, by 2019, we were transitioning. The pandemic was already starting. Fake news actually is traceable to have begun in the 1980s. That's very surprising. When I first read the first reports about fake news, it came out in the 1980s.
Okay,
they had a term for it.
What is the term?
The term was faux news, F-A-U-X. False news. So it has the same characteristics as fake news.
So if you were to continue the book, Vic, from 2019 to 2023, what would you add? What kind of information?
how much we have relied on the internet for our news. No? Because remember, a lot of newspapers closed down, a lot of magazines closed down.
Yes.
And of course, the transition of the work from home, the work from home status has greatly changed, especially in broadcast journalism, where broadcasters now have their homes as their news centers because they cannot go to the news center itself. And the heavy reliance on the internet.
That's right. Social media.
Change in our journalism.
Social media has really affected journalism nowadays. Social media influencers are even more popular than news anchors. You know, if you have a vlog, you're even more popular. You have 1 million viewers. You also have 1 million, 2 million followers compared to television and radio. I mean, that has really diminished over the years.
Blogging is actually an old system. We already had online reporters before, and but these were reporters who would make their own documentaries, make their own videos, then would distribute them to other news companies. And these are mostly freelance reporters. But with the advent of journalism, with the advent of the internet, this kind of journalism grew. Because now availability of information and the ability of transmitting this information has become wider.
Yes.
And of course easier for many of these so-called young journalists or new journalists.
Vic, briefly, what can we journalists of today and the young journalists that you mentioned learn from our journalist forefathers in the 18th and 19th centuries?
Well, they were interested. They had, unlike before, unlike today, our forefathers in journalism had to really scrape where to get the news. They had to travel. They had to ask people, of course, and they had to have access to a lot of things which were not accessible at that time. Okay, like documents from government documents, which were very private at the time. No? But eventually, as information started becoming more free and more open, mas swerte ang journalists ngayon because they have a wide range of accessibility to information. However, this is where the problem of fake news comes in, and the journalist now has the double responsibility of gathering the news and becoming a gatekeeper to truth.
A lot of lessons to be learned from our forefathers in journalism. Jose Victor Torres, author of Balita, The Story of Philippine Journalism, 1811 to 2019. Thank you so much for joining us on The Final Word.